The monitor beeped once, then slowed. Marin Castillo stood at the foot of bed 14, watching the green line stutter across the screen, and she already knew how this night was going to end. The old man in the bed had been talking for the last 20 minutes. Soft words, broken sentences. His oxygen mask fogged with every breath, and his hand kept reaching toward the nightstand, toward nothing, toward air. She had 6 other patients tonight. A code blue in room 9 an hour ago. A resident who kept paging her about labs that weren't even her responsibility. Her feet had gone numb somewhere around midnight, and it was almost 4 in the morning now. So when the old man whispered something she couldn't quite catch, she nodded the way you nod at someone when you're too tired to really listen, and she said, "I'll be right back, sir," and she left the room. She would spend the rest of her life wishing she hadn't. 3 minutes later, the monitor flatlined. By the time she got back into the room with the crash cart already rolling behind another nurse, it was too late. The man's chest didn't rise anymore. His hand had fallen open on top of the blanket, fingers loose, like he'd been holding something and let it go. There was a folded piece of paper under his palm. Marin didn't touch it right away. She stood there while the doctor called the time of death, while the room went quiet in that specific hospital way, machines still humming even though the person they were monitoring was already gone. She was 29 years old. She had been a nurse for 6 years. She had watched more than 40 people die in this hospital, and she had learned, the hard way, how to keep her hands steady and her voice calm no matter what was happening inside her chest. But something about this one man, this stranger, undid her. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her earlier that night, like he recognized her from somewhere, even though she was certain they'd never met. Maybe it was the fact that no family had come. No wife, no children, no visitors at all in the 3 days he'd been on her floor. Just an old man alone in a hospital bed, trying to tell a tired nurse something important, and the tired nurse walking away. She finally picked up the note. On the outside, in shaky handwriting, it said 3 words. For the nurse. Her hands were shaking when she unfolded it. If you believe there are still moments in this world where one small act of kindness changes everything, even for a stranger who looks like they have nothing left to give, stay with this story until the end. And if it moves you, hit like and subscribe, because what this letter said next would follow Marin for the rest of her life. The letter wasn't long. 4 sentences, written in the unsteady hand of a man who was running out of time. You reminded me of my daughter. I never got to say I was sorry. Please find her. Her name is written on the back. Marin turned the paper over. There was a name, an old address, crossed out and rewritten twice, like he'd tried to remember it correctly with the little strength he had left. And below that, one more line. Tell her I finally understood. Marin stood in that hospital room at 4 in the morning holding a dead man's last words, and she had absolutely no idea what any of it meant. She didn't even know his name. Not really. She'd read it off the chart 100 times, that shift without it meaning anything. Walter Hobbs, 78 years old. Admitted for heart failure. No emergency contact listed. No next of kin on file. A man who died completely alone, holding onto a message for a daughter he apparently hadn't spoken to in a very long time. She should have handed the note to the charge nurse. She should have let it go into his personal effects, into a bag that would sit in a hospital storage room for 30 days before being disposed of, the way unclaimed belongings always were. Instead, she folded it carefully and put it in her scrub pocket. She told herself she just needed a minute to think. She told herself she'd figure out the right thing to do once her shift ended. She had no way of knowing that this folded piece of paper was about to unravel a story that had been buried for 17 years. A story that involved a name she would recognize the moment she finally looked it up. A name that belonged to one of the most powerful men in the entire city. Marin didn't sleep when she got home that morning. She sat at her kitchen table with the note in front of her and her laptop open, typing the name from the back of the page into a search bar with hands that still hadn't fully stopped shaking. Elena Whitfield Cross. The second the results loaded, Marin's stomach dropped. Elena Whitfield Cross wasn't just anyone. She was the CEO of one of the largest hospital networks in the state, the very network that owned the hospital Marin worked in. Board photos, charity galas, A profile in a business magazine calling her the woman who rebuilt healthcare access for 3 counties from the ground up. There was no mention of a father named Walter Hobbs anywhere. No mention of him at all. Maren read everything she could find. Elena had built her career from nothing, according to every article. A single mother who put herself through nursing school first, then medical administration, then business school at night while raising a daughter alone. There was no father in the story. Not one line about him, not even in the longer profile pieces that usually loved digging into a person's whole life. It was like he'd been erased. Maren sat back in her chair, the morning light coming through her kitchen window, and she thought about the old man's face. The way his eyes had followed her around the room. The way he kept trying to talk, and she kept telling him to wait. She thought about the words on the note. I never got to say I was sorry. Sorry for what? She had a decision to make, and it terrified her. She could throw the note away, forget she ever read it, and let a dead stranger's secret stay buried, which was probably the safe thing, the professional thing, the thing that wouldn't risk her job at a hospital owned by the very woman this letter was addressed to. Or she could try to deliver a message from a man who had no one else in the world to deliver it for him. She thought about her own grandfather, who had died 3 years earlier in a nursing home 2 states away, how she hadn't made it there in time, how the nurse on duty that night had told her, gently, that he'd been talking about her right up until the end. That single sentence from a stranger had meant more to Maren than almost anything else in her grief. It had told her she mattered to him, even at the very end, even when she wasn't there. Maybe that was all this was. One nurse trying to give someone else what she never fully got for herself. She picked up her phone and started looking for a way to reach Elena Whitfield Cross. It took her 4 days and 11 emails to get anywhere. The general company inbox ignored her completely. The scheduling assistant sent back a polite form response about media inquiries needing to go through the corporate communications team. Maren wasn't press. She wasn't anybody important enough to matter to a woman who ran a company with 12,000 employees. So she did something that could have gotten her fired. She used her hospital badge to look up delivery information tied to a charity gala the network was hosting that weekend. One Elena Whitfield Cross was scheduled to attend in person. It wasn't information she was supposed to access for personal reasons. She knew that. She did it anyway. The gala was at a hotel downtown, the kind of place with marble floors and a doorman who looked at Maren's off-the-rack dress like he already knew she didn't belong there. She almost turned around twice before she even got inside. Once she was in, she realized how impossible her plan actually was. There were at least 300 people in that ballroom. String quartet playing somewhere near the back. Servers moving through the crowd with trays of food Maren couldn't have named if she tried. Elena Whitfield Cross was somewhere in that sea of expensive suits and evening gowns, and Maren had no plan beyond finding her and saying, essentially, a stranger gave me your father's dying words. She spotted her near the front of the room after almost 40 minutes of searching. Tall, composed, dark hair pulled back, laughing at something a man in a tuxedo had said. She looked exactly like her photos, confident, untouchable. Maren's hands were sweating around the folded note in her clutch. She started walking toward her, and that was the exact moment a security guard's hand closed around her arm. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your invitation. Maren froze. I don't have one, she admitted. But I have something that belongs to that woman. Something important. Please just give me 30 seconds. The guard's grip didn't loosen. Around them, a few nearby guests had already started to notice, the way people always notice when something goes slightly wrong in a room built for things to go perfectly. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me, the guard said, already starting to pull her toward the side exit. Maren felt the panic rising in her chest, the kind of panic where you realize you're about to lose the one chance you have, and without thinking it through, she called out across the room, loud enough that heads turned. His name was Walter Hobbs. The room didn't go silent, not entirely, but the noise near the front dropped fast. Elena Whitfield Cross turned around. For a moment, nothing happened. Maren stood there with a security guard's hand still on her arm, 300 strangers half watching, and Elena's face didn't move at all, like she was carved out of the same marble as the floor. Then something shifted behind her eyes. Let her go, Elena said quietly. The guard hesitated, then released Maren's arm. Elena crossed the room slowly, her heels echoing against the marble, and up close, Marin could see the color had drained from her face. "What did you say?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Walter Hobbs," Marin repeated. "I'm a nurse. I was with him when he passed, 4 nights ago. He asked me to find you." Elena's composure cracked in a way Marin hadn't expected from someone who ran an empire of hospitals, someone whose entire public identity was built on control and precision. Her eyes went glassy almost instantly. "That's not possible," she said. "He's been gone from my life for 17 years. I don't even know where he was living." "He was alone," Marin said gently. "No visitors. No family listed. Just me and a note he wrote before he died." Elena's hand came up to cover her mouth, almost the exact same gesture Marin remembered making herself, standing in that hospital room holding a stranger's last words. "He wrote a note," Elena repeated. Marin nodded and reached into her clutch. But before she could hand it over, the moment shattered. A man's voice cut through the crowd, sharp and irritated, calling Elena's name, and Marin turned to see a well-dressed older man striding toward them with the kind of urgency that told her something important was about to happen. Something that had nothing to do with a party. "We are exactly halfway through this story, and the biggest moment hasn't happened yet. So stay with me." Because the truth behind that note was about to change everything Elena thought she knew about her father. The man who approached was Elena's uncle, her mother's brother, a board member of the same hospital network. His name was Richard, and the look on his face when he heard what Marin had just said was not grief. It was fear. "Elena, we should discuss this privately," Richard said quickly, already trying to steer her away from Marin and the gathering attention of curious guests. Elena didn't move. "Why do you look like that?" she asked him, her voice suddenly sharp, suddenly the voice of a woman who had built and run a company for a decade, not the shaken daughter from a moment ago. Richard's jaw tightened. "Because this isn't the place. Uncle Richard." Her tone left no room for argument. "Why do you look like that?" Marin stood there awkwardly, the folded note still in her hand, watching a family secret crack open in real time in the middle of a ballroom. Richard finally spoke, low enough that only the 3 of them could hear. "Your father didn't abandon you and your mother the way we told you, Elena. It's more complicated than that." Elena went very still. "What do you mean, more complicated?" Richard glanced at Marin, like he was hoping she would simply disappear, and when she didn't, he exhaled and continued. "Your mother and I made a decision a long time ago when you were 11. Walter had gotten into serious debt. Gambling debt. It was going to bankrupt the family business your grandfather built, the business that eventually became the hospital network you now run. Your mother gave him a choice. Leave quietly and let us tell you he abandoned you, or stay and watch everything we'd built collapse, and you'd grow up with nothing." Elena's face had gone pale. "He chose to leave," Richard said. "For you. So you'd have a future. And we made sure he never came back into your life, because your mother believed it was cleaner that way. Believed you'd be better off hating an absent father than pitying a broken one." Marin felt something cold settle in her stomach, because she understood now exactly what those 4 sentences on that note had really meant. "I never got to say I was sorry. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for the debt. Sorry for 17 years of silence he never got to explain." Elena turned to Marin with tears already falling, no longer caring who in that ballroom was watching. "Please," she said, "give me the note." Marin handed it over. Elena read it standing right there in the middle of the gala, her hands trembling around the paper, and when she got to the last line, "Tell her I finally understood," she made a sound Marin would never forget for the rest of her life, a sound that came from somewhere far deeper than the polished, powerful woman standing in front of everyone. "He understood," Elena whispered. "He finally understood what?" Marin didn't have an answer to that. She wasn't sure anyone in that room did, except maybe the man who had written those words with his last few minutes of strength, a man who had died believing his daughter would never know the truth. Elena looked up at Marin, her mascara running, her carefully built composure completely gone. "I need to know everything," she said. "Every single thing that happened those final days. Will you tell me?" And that was the moment Marin realized this story wasn't over. It had barely even started. They sat together in a quiet side room of the hotel for almost 2 hours while the gala continued without them, and Marin told Elena everything she remembered. She told her about the 3 days Walter had been on her floor, quiet and polite even through obvious pain, always thanking the staff, never once complaining. She told her about the small details that stuck with nurses more than people realized, the way he'd asked about her day every single shift, the way he kept a folded photograph in his hospital gown pocket that Marin had noticed but never asked about. A photograph, Elena repeated. Do you know what was in it? Marin shook her head. I never looked. Felt private. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked the hospital to release his personal belongings to her, which, as the head of the network that owned the facility, took exactly 1 phone call. The bag arrived within the hour. Inside was almost nothing. A few clothing items, pair of worn reading glasses, a wallet with $11 in it and an expired driver's license. And the photograph. Elena unfolded it with shaking hands, and Marin watched her daughter's face crumble completely at what she found. It was a picture of Elena at 11 years old, sitting on a man's shoulders at what looked like a county fair, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in handwriting that had clearly aged and weakened over the years but had been retraced more than once, like someone kept coming back to touch the ink, were 4 words. The best day ever. He carried this, Elena said, barely able to speak. For 17 years, he carried a photo of one afternoon at a fair. Marin didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that could hold the size of what was in that room. I hated him, Elena whispered. My whole adult life, I built everything I built because I told myself I would never end up like him. Weak. Someone who walks away. And he was carrying proof that the best day of his entire life happened with me on his shoulders. And I never knew. Marin finally spoke, gently. He wasn't weak. From what your uncle said, he made an impossible choice to protect you. That's not the same thing. Elena looked up at her. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have thrown that note away. Nobody would have ever known. I almost did, Marin admitted. But I kept thinking about how he died alone in a room with no one to hear him. I couldn't let his last words disappear too. Elena reached across the small table and took Marin's hand, holding it the way you hold onto something solid when everything else in your life has just shifted underneath you. You gave me back my father, she said. 17 years too late, but you gave him back to me. 3 months later, Marin stood at a small cemetery on the edge of the city, the kind of place with modest headstones and a view of nothing in particular, watching Elena kneel in front of a grave that had, until recently, only had a temporary marker paid for by the county. The new headstone was simple. Walter Hobbs, beloved father, the best day ever. Elena had spent weeks tracking down every piece of her father's last 17 years, discovering he'd worked as a groundskeeper 2 towns over, lived modestly, never remarried, never asked anyone for anything, and had apparently kept a small folder in his apartment filled with newspaper clippings about his daughter's career, every promotion, every achievement, quietly celebrated from a distance he believed he wasn't allowed to cross. She started a program at the hospital network in his name, one that trained staff specifically on end-of-life communication, on making sure no patient's final words ever went unheard again. No matter how busy the floor was, no matter how short-staffed the shift. She asked Marin to help design it. Marin had almost said no. She still carried the guilt of that night, the 3 minutes she'd walked away, the fact that she hadn't been in the room when Walter took his last breath. But Elena had looked at her and said something Marin would carry with her for the rest of her career. You didn't fail him. You're the only person in his entire life who actually listened, even a little too late. Most people never get even that much. Standing at the graveside that afternoon, watching Elena place fresh flowers against the stone, Marin thought about how close she'd come to walking away from that folded note entirely. How easy it would have been to let it disappear into a hospital storage bag along with everything else that gets forgotten. One small act. One decision to care about a stranger's final wish instead of letting exhaustion win. It hadn't just given a grieving daughter her father back. It had rewritten the ending of a man's entire life, turning 17 years of silence into a story that finally, truly, understood him. If the story reminded you that kindness still has the power to change everything, even in someone's final moments, Even when it feels too small to matter, subscribe for more stories like this one. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is waiting for one person to simply listen.